Thank you, everyone, for joining this morning or this afternoon, maybe even this evening, depending on where you are. Today, as we do every quarter, we're going to be talking about the Q1 2024 Internet Security Report. This webinar is slightly late. We already have had a podcast about the report too, due to a slight scheduling hiccup and some summertime stuff. We're doing this one a little late, but it's still good information. Before we jump right into what we found via all our products in Q1 2024, let me just introduce myself. I'm Corey Nachreiner, the Chief Security or Chief Information Security, whichever you prefer, officer at WatchGuard. I take care of our enterprise security here, as well as a lot of traditional CTO things I used to do as well. Joining me is a new co-host. You're probably used to Mark, but with that, I'll hand it over to Trevor to give a little intro to yourself.
Thanks, Corey. I actually have been a couple while back on this presentation before, but I thanks for having me back here. I am Trevor Collins, security engineer at WatchGuard, and at this point, wear many hats. I work on the report. I work with Corey and Mark on different projects internally, and that's I wear many hats. But we do
Yeah,
have.
I would say our key security engineer running the back end of our SOC as well as doing a lot of the analysis as well. Yeah. And you've definitely, I think you've probably been on more than one. It's been at least three or four, Trevor. But you are used to us usually tag teaming with Mark, and do know this report is written by many more than me and Trevor. In fact, I probably only have an intro, outro, tips part of it, even though Mark and I started this report probably about 7 years ago now. But as you can see, some other co-authors are Mark himself, the Director of Security Operations. But we have other intrusion analysts and malware analysts like Ryan, who now has actually moved on to malware analysis as well, and Josh as well. So a lot of hard work from the entire team. What we're going to cover today follows our pretty normal agenda. This report is basically made up of a lot of quantifiable data from our different security products. Currently, we have mostly our network security products, which is the Firebox products. That catches all kinds of different network attacks. Besides being a next generation firewall, it has intrusion prevention. It has a bunch of anti-malware services I'll get into. So we'll talk about a lot of the attacks and malware we see from a network level, as we do every quarter, as well as some of the domains we see your users, customers clicking on that could be malicious. But we also have pulled in our endpoint data from our endpoint products. It used to be Adaptive Defense 360, which was a Panda security product, but now that has changed into WatchGuard EPDR, a fantastic product that both is endpoint protection and endpoint detection and response, or EDR. So a lot of endpoint related malware trends as well. And we do find the network and malware trends tend to differ depending on if you're looking from the network or endpoint level. The whole point of this is besides looking at what threat actors are doing and some of the trends, we obviously want to make sure that you always defend yourself. The good news about anything we're talking about in this report is the reason we're seeing it is fireboxes or endpoint products are detecting and blocking it. And as long as you can continue to configure them in that way and maybe adopt additional security strategies, you should be able to defend against the latest trends from these attackers. With that, why don't we jump right in and we'll quickly talk about the Firebox feed threat trends we saw for Q1. And before that, I'll do my typical intro for what is the Firebox feed. A lot of you have probably seen this Internet Security Report call before, so you probably kind of know what it is. But essentially, this is an anonymized opt-in threat feed. Firebox feed is just a marketing name for the threat feed that our network security products can send back to us. This is something you have to opt into. We really hope more people do opt into this. You can check out our report, which details exactly where you can go to in your configuration to kind of set this up. If you opt into it, we're, besides sharing information about licensing and services, we're mostly getting information about the different security services on your products. For instance, if there's a hit of gateway antivirus, if our signature-based legacy antivirus service catches malware, It will let us know what signature the malware was, and it will let us know things like the IP address that the particular whatever connection started that malware, whether it be web or email based connection. It is mostly anonymized data. We do know the external IP of your firewall, but we're not really getting any data about your internal network. And we certainly don't put any sort of identifying data in the report. So the number of services in the Firebox feed, I gave one example. We have three primary anti-malware services on the Firebox. The first is that gateway antivirus, which is primarily signature or pattern based. It's very good at quickly finding malware that experts already know about. But for the malware that's new, which happens every single day quite easily with techniques like packing and encrypting, you need more proactive anti-malware services. So Intelligent AV is a machine learning based antivirus engine. It applies machine learning models to looking at millions and millions of, say, executables or Word documents, depending on which file we're talking about. And it learns, here's millions of good files versus, a million bad files. And the machine learning algorithm will statistically learn indicators that it can use to very quickly, proactively identify new malware. And it is a very quick service, kind of like Gateway Antivirus. But our last safety net for malware protection is APT Blocker. APT Blocker is a behavioral analysis malware detection model that uses a behavioral sandbox. So essentially, if we get a file that might be suspicious that we've never ever seen before, we can submit it to the sandbox of APT Blocker. It runs it on a emulated system, the same Windows or Linux op, depending on what the file type is that you would use in your network, maybe even with the same programs like Adobe or Microsoft software. And as it's running that, it's analyzing all the behaviors and tricks that malware uses while it loads up, that potential malware, to decide whether or not, if it's done enough things that give us the confidence to call it malware. An APT blocker is one of the best ways to catch brand new malware. The only side effect, if we've never seen it before, we do have to sandbox it, and that takes a few minutes. So those are the three anti-malware services that are kind of contributing to this report. But also on the Firebox is our intrusion prevention service. When we start talking about network attacks, those are exploits detected by intrusion prevention. And they can be exploits that are affecting your servers, like web servers, file transfer servers, but they can also affect all your clients too. For instance, your web browsers. If people are browsing the web and hit a drive-by download site that's exploiting a Chrome vulnerability, IPS might detect the Chrome vulnerability in a client, not just server vulnerabilities. And the final service that contributes to this report is DNS Watch. And DNS Watch is essentially a DNS firewall or DNS filtering service. Basically, by our device acting as your DNS server, we have a huge and dynamically updated list of known bad domains, whether they be phishing domains, malware domains, and so on. And if we detect one of your users trying to find the IP address of a known bad domain using DNS, we can sinkhole them, tell them they accidentally clicked on a bad site, and then use all that data to talk about the bad sites your users are going to. So that's essentially the different services and the quantifiable data that contributes to the reports that we're going to share right now. So why don't we dive right in, and we'll start with malware trends. And this is actually the section Trevor writes. So in a moment, I'm going to hand it off to him. But let me start with some of the big highlights you can see here on this slide. The first big highlight is malware actually dropped almost 50%. I think it was around 49%. Trevor can confirm in a moment, which was quite a big drop, one of the most precipitous drops we've seen in a long time. In fact, last quarter, I believe it was in Q4 of 2023, I believe it was up around 80%. So right after that rise in malware, this was quite a big drop. And nowadays, rather than giving you the one really high volume number, we have split up malware to, or we now describe malware per firebox. So instead of giving you one huge number, as you can see, there's about 1,224 malware detections on average for every firebox. If you do check out our report, though, I'm trying to see if I can find it in the background right now. We will extrapolate. So now only a certain amount of fireboxes share data with us. But when we look at how many fireboxes are currently licensed, it gets into hundreds of thousands. And we've extrapolated that if each firebox is seeing a bit over 1,200 threats per device in Q1, that actually translates to 472.9 million, uh, almost 500 million malware incidents across all the devices that are currently active. Not even all the devices that are out there, just the ones that have active devices. So while it has dropped a bit, it is quite a bit of malware per firebox. You can also see the breakdown, which I'll let Trevor get into a little bit more when he talks about zero-day malware. But of our actual anti-malware services, usually, Gateway Antivirus catches a lot of stuff because it's signature based, and it did be as well this quarter. You can see it caught about 562 threats per box for the signature based service. That is actually an increase in what it did last quarter. But one of the surprising things is this quarter, Intelligent AV, our machine learning based algorithm, caught the most threats, 587 threats per box. And APT Blocker, which usually does pretty good. APT Blocker often in the past anyways has caught more threats than Intelligent AV. That has dropped quite a bit, which as you'll see in a moment will kind of affect our zero-day numbers. I will say, just a preview of the endpoint section, while network-based malware was down about 49%, you'll find that coincidentally, endpoint malware actually rose quite a bit this quarter. So it seems like if the network is detecting more, the endpoint detects less, and vice versa. But with that, let me hand it off to Trevor to talk a little bit about, if I can get my screen to go forward, zero-day malware.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so like Corey was saying, we have the different types of malware detection engines that we use to detect the malware. What we call zero day isn't necessarily malware with a 0 day in it, but it is in fact malware that we have never seen before. So these are brand new malware packages that are detected on the firebox by the IAV engine, which is that machine learning engine, or the APT blocker, which is that sandboxing engine to ensure that we don't allow any malware to pass through the firewall.
So
Now
to say it a
there's,
little slightly different, just to add my summary, Trevor, like zero day often is talking about exploits, like zero day network based exploits. That's not what this is. Zero-day malware is malware that is a new pattern. And basically, you are comparing IAV and APT blocker to the signature based. By definition, for something to have a signature, some analyst somewhere has to have seen it before. So we consider signature malware detection to be not zero-day because the signature is out. And you basically just compare, if our signature-based malware doesn't detect it, it has to hit IAV and APT blocker. And by definition, it means we didn't have a signature for it. So that's essentially why we call it zero-day malware, right?
absolutely. And
Cool.
it is malware that is more advanced malware, things that are coming out, more and more because even the creators of the malware know that signature-based malware is pretty prevalent. Everybody has it, and so they know they have to move on to new types of malware that can
Yeah.
bypass your basic firewall. So this is
If we
why
if we
the cat and mouse game, we have to continue
continues,
use
yeah.
IAV, use APT blocker, uh, and and
I
we'll get
Yep.
into it a little bit more about some other things that you can do to
If
prevent
I
the
were to
new
be a
types of
little
malware.
geeky, just to share a little extra, like we definitely, like you said, this type of malware is very much trying to be evasive, so it's often more sophisticated. But we have found there are very basic techniques to evade, and we see attackers use both. And so if you've seen any other webinars from WatchGuard, there's a couple of presentations where we talk about things like packing encrypting. Like recently, Mark and I at some of our partner conferences have been doing a presentation on sophisticated malware techniques. But packing encrypting is actually pretty easy. There's tools on GitHub, if you look them up, Amber, where you can take the exact same thread. So you take an executable that's bad, probably already has a signature for it, but packing encrypting basically use either compression or basic portable executable type cryptography. Without going into all the detail, portable executables basically have this stub at the beginning that tell them how to execute, and that stub has to do with legacy MS-DOS. But you can actually either create compression, which will change the binary view of the file. So just compressing a Trojan in a new way can make it have a different signature. Or you can use some sort of encryption with it by adding little encryption tricks in the stub of the file. Now the key to decrypt it, all of this has to be in the executable itself. So a smart analyst doing dynamic analysis can usually figure it out. But those are the types of techniques that take, maybe it is the same threat, maybe it's still Lockbit 4.0, but they can have a packer or crypto running on their distribution site that makes every single variant look brand new from a signature level. So those are the basic techniques, but like Trevor said, there's a lot of more sophisticated techniques too. Sorry for
Yeah,
going in the
and when
weeds,
I
Trevor.
say,
I thought it just was an interesting detail.
yeah, no, absolutely. And I say sophisticated simply because this is, we often see a lot of different malware, including uh, some more advanced malware like nation state, but there's sophisticated uh, malware as opposed to signature based. But
Absolutely.
like you were saying, I mean, yeah, there's command line programs that you can use to create encrypted malware, to change the signature so that there's no way that signature would catch that. But back to the slides here from our tangent. The 0-day malware is on your left side is the 0-day malware that covers everything. We then just look at the encrypted connection field, which is a 0-day malware with TLS. So that's, for example, your HTTPS connections and websites. We find that that 0-day malware is actually significantly more on those websites. And considering that, roughly 95%, that's kind of the quote that I've heard, of web traffic is
Google.
encrypted
Yeah.
traffic, that's a little bit actually closer to what we're seeing. And I think it makes sense because when you see the somebody who will take the time to set up their server with a website and certificate for encrypted traffic is usually going to put a little bit more effort into their malware and use those encryption methods or different advanced techniques to use
Yeah.
to be able to send that malware.
I totally agree, Trevor. For a little bit of historical context for the audience, one thing new in this, though, is so again, 0-day malware is just any malware arriving even over unencrypted connections, whereas the TLS one is primarily ones happening over the secure web, but it could be anything with TLS. But in the past, our 0-day malware numbers for both is typically pretty high, above 50%. The last few quarters, we've seen quite a precipitous drop in 0-day malware over unencrypted connections. So that 36% being 0-day versus 64 is rather unusual, and that's happened in a couple of quarters. Before, it's gone as high as 70%, but it's typically 50 to 60% even in unencrypted connections. But I think you're right that the number exactly flips when you go to TLS, which I think is kind of funny. But like you said, I think Google does some statistics, Akamai does some statistics. But if you look at your websites, like I would say 99% of the ones I go to are usually encrypted. It's very rare I'm going to an unencrypted website. So really the real action for malware is happening in encrypted channels. So that's the one you should care more about. But the main takeaway is 0-day malware dropped a bit for unencrypted connections, but it remains what we expect it to be for encrypted connections. I'd also point out that if you think about that, 36% is what gateway AV catches, and the rest is what those more proactive service catches. So it's very important to try to use those proactive services, because you'll miss a lot if you focus only on signature detection. But let's keep going. What else is interesting about malware, Trevor?
Sure. So we take a list. It'd be nice to have a list of every single type of malware that we see, but we see thousands, tens of thousands of different malware samples. So we take the top 10 malware detections that we have in this quarter, so in Q1, and we organize them to see, what's the most prevalent. I'm going to go into detail on a few of these malware samples later on, but for example, our top one is kind of a PUP, potentially unwanted program, uh, for adware category, and that's basically something that, it's an annoyance. It's not really going to infect your network, but the issue with adware, and the reason that that's actually a significant security risk, is because a lot of times the same servers that provide adware will also provide malware, and there's usually not a good mechanism for those who run the servers to prevent malware from being pushed through the adware. So that's something you definitely don't want to have on your corporate network. I
Yep.
will mention one thing that was new for this quarter, or we saw it the previous quarter, but we again saw it this quarter, was the Android exploit. Um, that was one that that was one of the Android uh, not an exploit, an Android malware program. And this is a program that's called IP Royals Pawns. And it's a program that basically pays to fill out surveys. So again, the issue with this type of malware, particularly this adware, is that it also, we found the servers that are spreading this type of adware is also spreading malware. So it
Yep.
could easily be pushed into your Android phone, and there are Android malware packages. They just didn't reach onto the top 10 list here. Um,
Yep.
and
One of
another
the
thing I
things
want
you're
to
holding by the, oh, go ahead. Shoot. Sorry.
Sure, no,
Finish.
no worries. Another thing I wanted to cover was the malware categories. So these are loose categories. There's a lot of overlap and between those, but we'll put these down and as different malware categories, and sometimes I just want to go over them real quick. So we have the adware that we kind of talked about. And then there's the malware category of the droppers. We got three of those. Those are essentially kind of drive-by, drops the malware onto the device, and then tries to execute it.
I
And
kind of
they're
I compared
usually
those.
individual.
Yeah, in that malware presentation me and Mark do, I talk about droppers, stagers, and downloaders. So they're basically small programs that aren't the full final payload. In fact, they're made specifically to not to have as little obviously malicious capability as they can. They might actually have the payload encrypted within the executable, but they are there to kind of get on a system, try to not look like malware, but do a bunch of things. One, they sometimes, a dropper or downloader might try to find and evade or disable security controls before they finally do whatever it's doing. But a dropper often will then unencrypt the real payload from wherever it has it, either in its own portable executable or by downloading it. And a downloader, by definition, goes and grabs something. So think of it as little ways to stage malware. And the reason I compared them to Star Wars' Imperial droid, like if you see that droid come down and start to look at your planet, it doesn't necessarily have an arsenal of guns on it, but if it's there, it's trying to scout the location for an attack that's about to come. But as you say, there's so much overlap. We get these categories from our gateway antivirus partner, And sometimes a dropper can also be a Trojan. There's so much overlap in these categories. But were you going to talk about the other ones like code injection now?
Yep. Yeah, that's a good way. The droid over the base, it's
Yeah.
something to watch out for. Which is actually why we a lot of times will see droppers in our network firewall.
Yep.
But then later on, the like endpoint uh, detections, you won't
That's an
see
excellent
as many.
stage. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Droppers,
there is.
downloaders, and stagers are what we see so much on fireboxes because if we can catch that, they never get to the actual the real payload they're trying to do after. Whereas the endpoint, if it gets to the endpoint, the dropper might have the opportunity to complete its task, and then you do see the final payload.
Yep. And finally,
Yeah.
we get to things like the win code injection. Let me cover that first. Is essentially the malware is injecting code into like a dynamic library or injecting code into a program so that when that program is running, it will run that malware. That's a certain type of obfuscation technique to be able to hide on the program when you have the you're not going to take a look at this particular piece of Windows program, even though it may have malware in it. That's how it hides in there. The Finally, there's the password sealers, which oftentimes start off as a dropper. The Office exploits, both self-explanatory. Both of those actually oftentimes start off as a dropper, or
Yep.
like the Office exploit is a dropper itself.
I agree. I think Office Exploit is a perfect example of one that could be called a dropper because it typically has script to do something bad, like download stuff later. It's interesting how they characterize. By the way, the one thing, there's a lot more interesting information in this particular top 10 that Trevor will get to, but he's trying not to give away the beast yet. But the generic KD, some of the here RPCs, and the URSA, later on, Trevor will detail some Chinese state-sponsored malware that all three of those were associated, if I recall correctly. And the Trojan at the end is also something that Trevor will talk about in more detail at the end. Time for widespread.
Yep, let's go on to the widespread. So here's our top widespread list. So instead of just taking the top malware detections overall, what we do in our top widespread list, as you may know, is we take we these are the detections that we see the most Firebox report on. And then we divide that by each country and each region. So we often see a lot of the Office exploits in this one, and the reason being is because they're a very popular dropper. So uh, the first one here that we see is going to be the one that we see the most of. However, if you go down and take a look at, say, the JS agent USF, uh, India saw 60. What you can read is 62, almost 63% of fireboxes in India saw this exploit. Or this malware. I don't know why I keep on getting those mixed up, but saw the malware. And something that you can also look at here is the top 3 countries are interesting to look at. And definitely, if you're in one of these countries, you need to watch out for these types of malware. But we also have the regional side, which shows a little bit of a not of a different picture on this. So, for example, um, if we take a look at some of these, there was an example that I lost here, but not just because you see the countries in the top 3 countries list doesn't mean that you're completely clean, that you don't have to worry about it. Because you also want to take a
So
look
what you're
at the
saying
regional
is
area.
basically the top three countries may not be in the top region. It might happen that the countries that are most affected are in the region that's affected the second most. I will say,
Exactly.
by the
Thanks
way,
for cleaning
speaking
it.
of region, this is a bit of a diversion, but we didn't put a. Sometimes one of the things our report shows, we're only giving you a fraction of what's in the report. We really hope you go check it out after the webinar. But we talk about also the malware threats by region. One interesting thing was you were talking about, Trevor, how one of those threats really impacted India. Something unusual we saw is 62% of malware, 62.7% of malware was in the APAC region, which India is of course part of the APAC region. So by far over half, most of the malware that we had detections for this quarter were all from APAC. Meanwhile, the Americas was only about 22.5%, and EMEA was only about 14.7%. And that is kind of just so you know, we weight those regional averages because we don't want sales numbers in different regions to affect the results. Like if you sold less in one region, it would obviously potentially become the least common region to have detections because there's just less stuff there. So we have already removed that capability. We do these results weighed against how many fireboxers are in the region. Typically, Americas and EMEA are at the top, but besides what you're showing here in the widespread malware geographical distribution, just know all of the malware this quarter was primarily detected in the APAC region, Asia Pacific.
Yep. Yeah, and the widespread malware and the regional malware, those are all different information that will end up coming to what we can conclude on, and we'll cover some of the conclusions later on, but um, definitely need to keep an eye on the different types of malware that's in your region. So,
And without going into too much detail, because you're going to do it just on this list, we haven't covered all 5 of these in much detail, but that bash.mirai, I believe that is the one that Trevor will detail coming up right next, actually.
yep.
So should I pop on the first
So,
of?
yeah, just go ahead and pop on.
No, yeah. Oh, sorry, one at a time.
No. So this is a variant of the Mariah botnet, which is Morai, uh, however you want to pronounce that.
It's
But
hard. This is just to let folks know. Everyone probably knows the Mirai botnet, which is probably a little over 10 years old now. Mirai is a Linux-based botnet that targeted Internet of Things devices, primarily consumer routers, wireless gateways, and devices that ran Linux. It targeted them in many different ways, sometimes weak credentials at first. Later on, it started using variants, but there's been a bazillion variants of Mirai, and this latest variant, which it's confusing to pronounce, is now moved to a new name, Miori. So Miori is a variant of Mirai. Say that like 3 times fast, Trevor. I certainly can't.
Maury. Yeah. Anyways,
Miori.
so anyways, on this botnet here, what we found that it starts actually using an exploit. Its exploit just came out last year, and it targets the TP Link Archer devices, and those are network switches that you have
Actually,
each on
wireless,
your
like a
network, right?
very, very common wireless routers. I actually used to recommend them because they have, like there was when 6E first came out, I think I actually have a TP-Link device. They're things you can find on Best Buy and Amazon to set up a wireless network. So
Oh,
very common. And like you say, I think it was CVE 2023-1389 is the vulnerability in the router. So like you
right.
say, a new one from 2023.
Right. I hope you updated your firmware on that router.
I I did. Luckily, it wasn't. There's a bunch of different archers, and apparently my number wasn't on the list, but I updated anyways.
Okay, good deal. The last thing to mention on this
Oops, sorry.
particular malware was that it was one of the widespread, just like what Corey was bringing up. It was one of the most widespread malwares. So that's something that definitely keep an eye on. If you have any of those devices, check to see if your device is vulnerable and make sure they have it updated.
And I would also mention, by the way, a lot of these devices that both Mirai and Miori target we call them consumer devices that you can find at Best Buy. So you think, okay, maybe it's not a business thing I have to worry about. But if you're like a partner, a managed service provider that helps small businesses, or if you are a small business listening, I do think some of these consumer routers do end up in business. You know, if you have a very small business, they don't always buy enterprise level network gear. So definitely be on the lookout for it.
Yep. Yeah, a lot of times it's hard to put down that much amount of money for commercial gear, so you use consumer grade. So the next malware sample that we wanted investigated in the report was the Golden Spy malware campaign. So what this started off with is there was a tax software in the Asian region, specifically China, that was updated to basically spy on its users. Well,
And this was
uh,
legitimate, right? Like quote unquote
yes,
legitimate tax software. This is something a company actually sold as real tax software, right, Trevor?
yes, the legitimate tax software, and we don't know how deep it goes as far as in the from the business side, but the business released a program, an update that essentially spied on the users, gathered information from the users who were using this tax software, and we don't know what they were doing with it, but some researchers found out that they were gathering that information and then created a program to remove it. Well,
Did they say the
uh,
company, you mean, or the
the
researchers?
comp
Did the research? Yeah, yeah. The company after the analysis came out, there was an additional thing that removed it that the
well,
company made to remove it.
both actually.
Oh,
So
cool,
the company,
interesting.
the researchers created something. It wasn't super popular, but the company then removed it. Um, and this is Asino, was it's a program business. So uh, what happened though was after the reports came out and then Asino created Golden Helper, as it's been called, to remove that software, but they did it in such a way to hide it, and the the actual removal program was obfuscated to make it seem like it was just a regular update, not to not to actually remove the information that users were passing on that information to Asino. So what was happening was they were trying to hide that again. Uh, and this, because of the obfuscation, because of the way that they were doing it, it's really still malware, because it wasn't actually an update to the program.
Yeah,
So
it
this
fixed the spine, but it was trying to be stealthy about it. So it's like almost a cover up.
Right, right, and it absolutely was a cover up. So then more researchers found that, and then finally, this sample that we found was a second attempt at removing, just completely wiping off any of the user spyware that the program installed. But it was once again found and once again marked as malware. So that's this kind of a this long uh, escapade of this company trying to hide what they were doing. Um,
To
now,
put it differently, by the way, there's many case. One of the things we worry about in the security industry right now is digital supply chain attacks. And what we mean by digital or software supply chain attacks are when, say, a company like SolarWinds might get breached themselves. They get hacked, and when the hackers get in, they enumerate the network, they do lateral movement, they find the source code repositories, and they take the company's product and add a Trojan to it. And in that case, obviously, the company got hacked, so they do have to worry about their security, but you may not, it's not the company necessarily trying to spy on you. But I think what we're saying here is, while we're purely speculating here, it's hard to prove this kind of thing. This in China, because they have an authoritarian government, they often have the capability to get into companies and get folks to do stuff. So what it kind of looks like is this may not have, again, speculation, but this may not, doesn't seem like it was a supply chain attack from an external actor, but it may actually be some sort of state sponsored thing that they first did. But when they were found out, now they're trying to clean it up.
Yep.
So, anyways, it's just an interesting, unfortunately, because real digital supply chain attacks happen where it really was an external hacker that breached a company. It's hard for us to say, but just because of where this is, and I think as Trevor's about to say, a state-sponsored organization owns IECNO. This is actually an interesting case.
Yeah, yeah. The China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation (CASIC) owns Asino, and so essentially this is state-sponsored, um, attacking their own users, their own
Yeah.
citizens, is what it appears like to me.
And it also, I mean, they have a great firewall of China. They're already technically censoring and manning the middle lanes and frankly spying on their citizens. So it's not really a leap to consider something like this happening.
Yep. Uh, that's all I have for the Golden Spy. Let's take a look at Pixie Rat.
But
So
a reminder, there we actually found three different variants in our top 10 related to that Golden Spy and Golden Helper campaign, right?
correct, correct. If I recall correctly, that uh, and so Pixie Rat basically starts off as an Office document. It uses the macro exploit to gain foothold. Um, most a certain type of dropper was used, and this contained a PowerShell script that was obfuscated. Um, now, and it's obfuscated PowerShell script that runs in memory, so it's living off the land, and so there's no actual file that's being downloaded on your computer. Everything is just in memory. So things like basic antivirus that would only scan your hard drive would never ever see anything like this.
Yeah.
Um, like I said, it uses basic base 64 encoding, but in that base 64 encoding, it has another layer of obfuscation. Uses a certain numbering and encryption technique. Not really encryption because it's kind of there in the script, but we were we were able to identify that because of the way that it was being encrypted, that it was actually a Cobalt Strike beacon. Now, for those unfamiliar, Cobalt Strike is a popular penetration testing program that you can
Yeah,
use
an
to.
exploit framework similar to Metasploit. A lot of you probably have heard of Metasploit. Cobalt Strike is very similar. It's an exploit framework, but a commercial one with a little bit more power and sometimes more exploits.
Right, and a few years ago, it was actually a lot of the exploits or a lot of that framework was released to the public, and now people are using it for illegitimate purposes, even though it's uh, originally created for legitimate purposes.
Yeah, it's
Um,
also one of the top pirated. I remember Underground selling pirated versions of Cobalt Strike before they even opened some of it up.
yep, yes, very, very popular nowadays to be used actually. So, and the reason, so this particular piece of malware, we could have been a false positive because maybe it was somebody who was using that legitimately, and we could, say, okay, well, because it's legitimately testing, it's not actually a real in the wild sample of malware. However, we found a particular URL in the script that we knew has been used in the past to attack healthcare. Um, and I believe it was in England. There's a healthcare facility that was actually used to attack. Uh, and so, and now because of that, we were able to identify that this was in fact malware because it was associated with that healthcare target.
Cool. So, despite all the weird names in our top 10 list, when you dive into the details, a lot of interesting stuff going on, like targeting IoT devices. So be careful for that. State-sponsored people are definitely sending malware around the world to private citizens. And good old-fashioned Word documents can contain some pretty nasty healthcare payloads. With that, let's quickly transition to network because we only have a bit of time and I want to get the endpoint too. We'll go very fast for our network trends. So for our network trends that are based on IPS, at the highest level, you can see here that we detected about 98 network attacks per firebox that was reporting in. That's up a little bit, up by about 13%. But it's also when we normalized our data to get rid of anomalies, the amount of network attacks that we've decided are real really have dropped in the past year. Before, you would have seen something like 300 or so per firebox, but we did some statistical analysis to throw out everything but the bell curve. Sometimes there were attacks that seemed to affect one customer in high volume, which could be a misconfiguration or something just on their network. So we throw out everything but the 95% of statistic of results that really match the rest of the world. But nonetheless, IPS is up a little bit. Now, typically we show you the top 10, but we're finding the top 10 is getting boring. It's the same things over and over. And we believe this is mostly due to the fact that malware, things like Trojans and botnets, often have some sort of auto infect capability. If I have a botnet on your computer, a botnet Trojan, one of the things I can do is use your computer to start scanning the internet for new victims. And they do so with exploits, libraries of exploits. So usually it's the same old exploits, sometimes lots of old ones that they just spam the internet with. And that's why we believe our top 10 attacks are either those exploit kits or could be vulnerability assessment tools going through the normal tests to find old vulnerabilities. So instead of looking at the top 10 this quarter, we decided to go into the top 50 and take a peek at some of the new signatures that just rose to the top 50 list. And that's what you see here. I'll explain a few of them really quickly. The first one, WebGNU Bash, is a vulnerability or exploit you probably have heard about, although rather old. This is a 10-year-old vulnerability for shell shock. If you don't remember shell shock, it was a vulnerability that Michael Zalewski found back in September 2014. He has a great blog post that goes into a lot of detail on the issue, but it was basically an exploit that affected a lot of web servers and gave bad guys the ability to execute arbitrary commands. Now, besides this rising to our top 50 list, here at WatchGuard, we actually have what we call a honeynet. It's a bunch of purposely insecure fireboxes that we run in different non-WatchGuard locations around the world. Not only are they purposely insecure and badly set up, but we have modified them to do a lot of packet sniffing and other monitoring to see we want attackers to target them and start to do attacks. And if you go to our report, you'll see some screenshots where during the end of Q4 all the way through Q1, we actually caught a variant of a campaign targeting shell shock specifically on one of our competitors' SSL VPN appliances. So interesting detail on this vulnerability. Check out the report for a little bit more about how our honeynet caught that. The second one, in fact, both the second one and the last one are two different Apache Struts vulnerabilities. Apache Struts is a framework that sits on top of your web server that provides a lot of, kind of already created default capability for you. Both of these are older flaws. The first one, the second on the list, is a Apache Struts flaw from 2010 that was in the XWork framework. Even though this is a kind of a almost 15-year-old vulnerability, it's one we see exploited a lot because it's very easy to exploit and it's remote code execution. And that's the same for the one at the bottom, the one you see that signature 1133.995 or I'm sorry, 958. That is another more current Apache Struts vulnerability. That was a relatively big Apache Struts vulnerability that came out in 2017 and had a CVSS score, CVSS is kind of the common vulnerability scoring system of 9.8 out of 10. So just zero point 0.2 away from the most risky vulnerability out there, because it had to do with one of the Apache Struts action forms, which is where you can create web applications that you do user input, create a form post, and basically they didn't use enough input validation. So bad guys could easily take advantage of any web application that had this Apache Struts version to execute code. So those are three of those four threats. We lately haven't seen a lot of new stuff in IPS, but it is interesting to see big name vulnerabilities like shell shock and things like the Apache Struts vulnerability pop up. The last section for the Firebox feed, and we'll have to jump straight to malware after we give some tips, is talking about the malicious domains we see every quarter. So our DNS watch service on the Firebox will always monitor domain lookups whenever your users click a link. As you know, DNS will translate a domain name to an IP address. And when that happens, we make sure that the domain name, before they get an IP address, we want to make sure the domain name doesn't go to a bad place. So in our report, we talk about the top malware domains, which are domains that somehow get to distributing malware. The top compromised domains, compromised are legitimate websites that have somehow been taken over by attackers to do something bad, whether it be phishing or some sort of malware delivery. And finally, the top phishing sites, which is, pretty intuitively understandable, a site that's trying to phish you. What you're looking at here is our top 10 malware domains that different users were clicking on. If I gave you two examples of interesting things here, two of those domains, the ones that start with Pandora main and the one that starts with PCDN bus, both of these domains were domains that were used in something called the Pandoraspear campaign. Pandoraspear was a campaign launched by Chinese located threat actors targeting both smart TVs and set-top boxes that used Android. In the report, we have a link to a very good, it's written in English too, but it's from a Chinese research group that studied this particular attack. And basically 1,700 smart TVs were taken over and made to be part of a botnet. And those TVs use Android as their smart TV system. They have some sort of vendor-based UI that allows them to load apps, Android apps like Netflix and other streaming apps. But long story short, the blog post goes into detail about how you could sideload malicious APKs onto TVs to get additional features, but those APKs came with this malware that infected them. And basically, some of the users that have fireboxes might have smart TVs that are reaching out to the command and control channel. The other interesting domain we saw was the one using something that looks like an Amazon AWS link, but isn't quite that. But it's actually serving the Darkgate malware. Darkgate is ransomware. There's many different variants of it, and it's a group that creates ransomware as a service. So affiliates can download it for free. When they infect victims, some of their ransom will go to the people that created the ransomware. But it looks like there's a number of folks that might have beacons from their network that are Darkgate beacons. Going quickly now, just because we have a little time, for compromised sites, these are the top compromised sites. There's not a ton of interesting stories here. I will say the one at the top, adriver.ru, is further proof of things like malvertising. There's a lot of sites out there, Google Analytics is the most obvious example, but there's a lot of smaller marketing organizations where their whole thing is to offer advertising, where if you go with them, they'll have a little bit of HTML you can pick to advertise your website, and they will post it in different advertising iframes that they pay for at different sites. But if they don't kind of vet the data coming from their customers, if the advertiser doesn't make sure the code you're giving them that is supposed to code to your product or website isn't bad, you can use it to inject malware and other things. So that domain is associated with malicious malvertising. For phishing, this is the list of phishing sites we saw. Notice the use of some legitimate sites like the SharePoint.com sites. Is you're able to make a customer specific, a higher level domain on the SharePoint domain. So just remember, it's not uncommon that sometimes sites that have a legitimate domain still are owned by a threat actor because of this ability to kind of have your own banner on top of it. But because we didn't find anything interesting in the phishing list, we thought we would actually do something else, which is DNS Watch, this service where we're monitoring domains. We get feedback from from threat intelligence, but also from customers when they encounter domains that we add to our list every quarter. So we thought we'd just share one of the phishing domains that was added in Q1. What was basically happening is we saw a particular email that was happening, a phishing email that talked about, you are entitled to get 10% of the latest value of your vehicle for some, legal reason that actually doesn't exist. But if you clicked on this email, it would actually take you to this domain you see on this side, blawx.com. Don't click on that, by the way. Whenever we put the dots and brackets, is because it's dangerous to visit those places, or at least was. If you visited that particular site, it actually would tell you that there's instructions on how to get this payout. But if you click those instructions, it actually downloads a JavaScript file. And the JavaScript file at first may not look like JavaScript. If you open it, it's a lot of text, and the text does pretend to be instructions. But if you scroll down in the file later on, there is some actual JavaScript that runs. And the JavaScript included, excuse the misspelling, but included some PowerShell. And the PowerShell, using similar obfuscation techniques to that Trevor talked before, would run basically a lot of things to download code from another site, which you can see here. It was a zip file that, when unpacked, included things like run client32.exe, which is actually a remote access Trojan, specifically when using a kind of semi-legitimate support tool called net support tool. So this is just an example of how not only does DNS Watch catch a lot of these malicious domains, but we're constantly updating it with new things. And this is the type of phishing type domain that would show up in DNS Watch. I'm not going to go over the obfuscation in detail because we're running out of time. If we can go really quickly, Trevor, and we'll go a little slower on the last tips. Do you want to start with the first tip here?
Yep, absolutely. So what we recommend for defensive tips is to use a zero trust to isolate the networks. Because of the Darkgate, the Maori, and the Pandoraspear botnets, we need to protect all of our devices, including our IoT devices. Oftentimes we talk about network segmentation. We all know, don't connect your guest network to your IT network. However, we also should not be connecting our sales network to our engineering network. So each department should have its own segmentation. Make sure your critical servers are secure and don't allow people to just surf the website on a critical server. Things like that are when we talk about the zero trust and isolating the networks to
Yeah.
have the better security.
And department by department is one good way to do it, but if you don't want to have so many for a department, you can do it by trust level too. Like critical servers should not be on the same network as just user workstations, should not be on the same network as IoT devices. IoT devices should also be isolated. You will have to add access control rules because normal users might still need to access the IoT devices. But if they're segmented, you can control the access in a limited fashion to only allow what's allowed. The next tip is programs need software updates. You should update your programs. A lot of the network exploits I talked about were to old software, but there's plenty of exploits to new software as well. Make sure to patch. I'm going to leave it as simple as that for time because I want to speed through the endpoint section.
And we need to protect our devices using multi-layered protection. Things like the IoT device, TP-Link Archer device. Those are things that, unless we have multiple layers, they're not going to be protected. We have endpoint protection for Windows, Mac OS, Linux-based servers, user workstations, things like that. But if we don't have network-based protection for these IoT devices, then they're going to be infected. They're going to get
Yeah.
malware put on there.
Another
Things like
example of multi-layered protection might be like for a traditional computer, you should both use network and endpoint protection because a traditional computer can, but some IoT devices may not be able to have endpoint installed on it. But remember, there's multiple layers of network protection. Firewalling is only one thing. You can have intrusion prevention to check for exploits. You can have network-based anti-malware protection. So multi-layered protection could be different types, endpoint, network, or identity, but it could also be different layers within the same type.
absolutely, yep, and you
Oops.
need some advanced firewall that includes the IPS, includes that multiple layers of network protection as well.
Yeah. And I'm sorry for going over, but I will speed through this. For endpoint protection, the key thing in endpoint protection is we just mentioned a network level malware volume was down. We saw less detections, but in endpoint malware volume was up over 80%. You can see here the chart of basically what malware volume was for the past year. It spiked up quite a bit in Q1. So we're catching a lot of stuff at the endpoint. Another interesting thing at the endpoint is this is a chart that talks about, so there could be lots of different variants of a lock bit. But if we say a unique variant, it always will have the same hash. This chart shows for uh, if a unique hash, how many times it showed up on one machine, meaning it was seen by that machine, that same hash was seen by many, many machines, versus if it was seen by 2 or 5 machines, 5 or 10, and so on. And basically, the main takeaway we want to share here is the number one machine saw a huge amount of the same hash. Attacks became widespread. Not only did volume go up, but we would see some of this malware, the same exact variant, hit many, many, many different endpoints around the world, showing that rather than repacking malware and making a unique variant for everybody, instead it seems like the malware they were launching was very noisy malware that they sent to everyone. So that was another trend from the endpoint section. The final thing, there is a ton of detail I'm not covering about ransomware groups and all kinds of other things in the endpoint section. And there's also some detail about what browsers are the most targeted browsers. But one of the main sections also talks about the most common vector that malware infects endpoints. So how are they trying to get malware on the machine itself? It can be everything from injecting a Windows program to an Office document, a PDF file, a browser drive-by download. But the most common way is still scripts by far, running JavaScript or PowerShell scripts, and PowerShell seems to be the most prominent at about 90% of this 48%. Scripts are the most common way they start launching malware on an endpoint, which means they're using a living off the land technique to start malware. Living off the land technique could be completely fileless, where they inject everything in memory, but do know living off the land technique can also download something too. So it may not be completely fileless every time, but just the fact they're using scripts to start it shows that living off the land techniques are prevalent. And just to save time, I'm going to go through the final protection tips because we're over. The final protection tips is I mentioned you should patch all your software, including old software, because of old flaws like shell shock and the Apache Struts vulnerabilities. But do not forget to patch your Internet of Things devices or your operational technology. There's a lot of hardware you use in networking, not just in your LAN closet, not just your routers and switches, but maybe your teleconferencing, maybe your VoIP system, maybe the collaboration TVs you have in meeting rooms. All of those hardware devices have firmware, which is essentially software. Be sure to update them because, as you saw with Pandoraspear, people are attacking IoT devices too, and they're a very tricksy, hard to detect place. Like, you don't suspect your smart TVs as being hacked normally, so if they do get infected, it's very dangerous. Next thing is train your users about the dangers of unsolicited Office documents. In a couple of different the trends we saw, for instance, the Pixie Trojan malware that Trevor talked about. Office documents are a common way to start malware. And the reason we worry about Office documents is to a normal user, they seem benign and they're documents you use all the time in business. They're not documents you can block because you do legitimately use them often. But your users need to realize if they're receiving a document that they don't expect, if it's in an email that's in any way kind of, I don't know why I'm getting this, that should trigger them not to touch that Office document. Even if they seem to receive an Office document in email from someone they know, they should confirm in another channel if it was unsolicited, if the person really sent it before interacting with it. And if you do interact with it, do not enable content, do not enable macros unless you know 100% you can trust the document. And finally, be sure to defend against botnets, whether it's a Smart TV botnet, a Miori new version of Mirai botnet, or some of the Darkgate botnets that spread ransomware that we've seen before. Botnets are popping up big time. Trevor gave a lot of tips, and even the tips we gave in our first tip section covers a lot of the multi-layered protection you need to defend against them. But be on the lookout. Botnets are becoming popular again. With that, thank you very much. Sorry we went 6 minutes over. If there are any questions, we'll go look at them now, but I didn't see any earlier, but we'd be happy to answer any questions. And feel free to check out our 443 Security podcast on our website. With that, I know we're over time, but if I can hit the right key, I will take a
I see
real quick
one
peek.
question.
Go
I
for
don't
it.
know if you
Check it.
wanted to answer that now or just email them
Go.
later.
If
Oh,
people
sure.
stay, don't mind.
Yep. If you want to say that the question was seeking to protect public electric utility, which WatchGuard tools would you recommend to work tandem with Tempered, which is now Johnson Controls, or Airwall, which is an air gap solution to protect PLCs?
PLCs.
So,
So go ahead, Trevor. If you have an answer, I do too.
sure. I'll kind of give what my recommendations were. So when you're talking about things like Johnson Controls, things where you need that air gap, there's still going to be uh, integrations between the physical security and the internet. There's an air gap is obviously the best solution, but a lot of times you still need access to the administrative side or to check even logs, things like that. So if you're checking logs from one computer to your uh, Johnson Controls, but you still use that internet for that computer, you need an endpoint protection on that computer. From the network side, you're obviously, like we were talking about, want to make sure that no botnets, no types of IoT infections, no types of industrial control malware is going to get infected on that device. So you're going to need a good firewall, good IPS, good
Yeah.
protection on that side to identify any types of attacks or botnets.
If I would
Another
add my color to this, I would say that, I mean, primarily when we see industrial controller manufacturing or utility networks, I recommend our network protections first. Oftentimes on things like programmable logic controllers and very specific purpose-specific devices, you can't necessarily load our endpoint protection. But you can tell me this better as someone that works in utility, but I'm curious how real the air gap is. Is it literally an air gap that you can only cross with USB, or is it a segmented network with very hard access controls? What I see in a lot of utilities is they have the office network, which might have access to the internet. Then they have the SCADA network, I won't remember that acronym, but basically before you even get to the specific purpose devices in the electric utility, area, you have all the devices that are getting network connection communications from your, different utilities to show a human what's going on the utility grid. And that network, the SCADA or the human interface network, has to have some sort of connection, typically to these devices, in order to get the telemetry to tell you what's going on. So obviously the office network shouldn't be connected, or should be like the office network should be air gapped from both of those, or at the very least have a one-way access control list that doesn't allow anything to go into the SCADA network. But the SCADA network in the actual devices that are technically PLCs sometimes has connection. So our network devices, typically a lot of modern utility networks, including electrical utility, still uses TCP/IP and Ethernet to transit. The only difference is things like protocols. A lot of utility devices use Modbus and protocols that are not as normal in consumer networking. But because they're still TCP, our device can fully segment them. We do have a ruggedized version of our tabletop, a version that's supposed to be like in really weird environments, including maybe sitting in with, I forget the standard you have to rack mount different PLCs that are out in the wild, but the ruggedized version can help you there. We do have some signatures for SCADA related things in Schneider Electronics, Honeywell, Modbus protocol vulnerabilities, but we are not specific made for those type of networks. But I think our network security controls can really help you segment. If you're truly air gapping, meaning they're not networked together, it depends on how you transit connection into them. But I find that most utility networks at least have some outside connections going to a SCADA, the place where people are central command for the utilities. And we're very good at helping make those segments and doing the access control lists. So excellent, interesting question. We have some old SCADA presentations.
So always interesting on that hardware controls. You need unique solutions for that.
Yeah, cool. Well, thank you all. I see to the person that asked that we'll have your email address. So if you want to talk more about it, happy to talk to you. But I'd like to thank you all for joining today. Sorry we went a bit over, but thank you for sticking with us. And thank you, Trevor, for joining us this quarter.
All right. Thanks, Corey. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.